Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into the origins and evolution of American government. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also the host of this discussion. And here he is, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Agnes, and Happy New Year to everyone as we begin this new year at the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I can't tell you how glad I am that we're into a new year, and I can't think of a better way to begin the new year than by doing a program here on the 2nd of January. While the bowl games are going on, continue to go on, this is I think we had over 60 bowl games this holiday season. But anyway, the bulk of them are over today, and of course then the national championship, collegiate championship, is next Monday night between Alabama and Clemson. And I'm telling people things that I know you already know. The fact of the matter is, it is a new year, and as I look back on 2016, I can think of a lot better years that I've had. And one of the more positive aspects of 2016, as it was 2015 and 14, was my opportunity to come on a regular basis here to the Virtual Center and to discuss some of the major issues of the day. I continue to look forward to that as we look forward to the new year. But I guess, in my own personal situation, there have been some real negatives associated with 2016. As I mentioned on the air, we had some very, very serious floods here in southern West Virginia in June. My wife lost a house in that flood. It was no insurance or anything, and it was the home that she raised her children in. And so it had very, very emotional meaning to her and her children, and it's gone. And in fact, she had to borrow money to take the house down, and now she's repaying a loan to remove the house and take it down because it was obviously a danger standing because of the flood waters had pretty well weakened the foundation to the point that it was a danger and it had to come down. So, and we think back on that, and then we've had health issues, and with me, and I have to apologize because for the bulk of the month of December, I was looking yesterday at the calendar, and I can remember that the 7th of December. I remember it very well because not only was it Pearl Harbor Day, but it happens to be my brother's anniversary, and but I was down with the flu that weekend, that Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. And I remember that because I had to cancel a senior citizens history class that I teach on Friday mornings. And that was early in December. And I was still missing programs here at the Virtual Center right up to the end of the end of the month. So the fact of the matter is it took me pretty much 4 weeks to shake what I've had, a history my whole life of chest colds, and I guess it's related to the fact that I, as a child, when I was 4, I think, I had pneumonia, and it was actually before penicillin. So the fact of the matter is, I was laid up for about 3 months with pneumonia, and it did some damage to my lungs, and so consequently, I've been susceptible to chest colds ever since. But this one was something because it began with the flu and it left me with that, and I couldn't get rid of it, and I couldn't stop coughing. And I was beginning to wonder, if I ever would get rid of it. And then over the last 3 or 4 days, I felt very, very good, and I haven't. I feel like I've gotten beyond it, and so I'm looking forward to this week's programs here at the Virtual Center. I'm looking forward to the new year. There are some frightening things about the new year, as we've alluded to here at the Virtual Center, and as we see in the media all the time. But the fact of the matter it is a new year, and I think it's there's no question that going into it with a positive attitude is the way to go. So let me do that, and let me first of all, again, wish all of you a very, very happy new year. And let me thank you for your continued support for the Head On Radio Network and for the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, which we are very, very fortunate that the Head On Radio Network, Bob Kincaid and Agnes and those folks continue to support us and allow these programs, allow us to come to you on a regular basis. So thank you, and we look forward to an exciting year. I would love to hear from you. I continue to give the phone number. Agnes is there in the studios, and we will get you on the air if you would like to join us and to share your thoughts about some of the issues. And again, it's hard to relate to what we talked about the last time we were together here at the Virtual Center because there were more programs canceled, live programs canceled than there were held in the month of December. And I apologize for that, and hopefully that won't be an issue again. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. 4676, of course, on your keypad translates into Horn, Horn. If you'd like to communicate with me, I do have an email address, and if you share your thoughts with me in an email, I'll do the very best I can to represent you as best I can and share your thoughts and your concerns or considerations or fears, hopes, whatever they might be, with our listeners, if they indeed do seem appropriate. Because chances are that if you've offered something substantive to me in an email, then it's something that our other listeners would benefit from hearing as well. So my email address is W-A-O'Brien, O-B-R-I-E-N 906 @gmail.com. That's W-A O'Brien, O-B-R-I-E-N 906. That's all one word, lowercase, @gmail.com. And I've been pretty faithful of late on the Facebook page. I have posted a number of things over the last couple of weeks on Facebook and on our Virtual Center page. And for those of you who haven't taken the opportunity or availed yourself of the opportunity to check out our Facebook page, I invite you to do that. I've posted a number of things on there. I continue to share links to particular articles. I've got one or two, kind of cranking around in my brain right now that I want to get to after we do the program today, maybe later this afternoon or this evening before we go on the air tomorrow. And let me remind you again that tomorrow's program will begin 1/2 hour later than today. We'll be on the air 1:30 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time on Tuesdays. But again, on Wednesday, Lord willing, we'll be back at our regular 1 p.m. time. So I look forward to these programs. I look forward to hearing from you, whether it's on Facebook, whether it's by an email, or whether it's from a call directly to our program while we're on the air live. On Facebook, if you are a user of Facebook, you know how easy it is. Just go to the homepage, facebook.com, and in the search box at the top, just type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you will have access to our Facebook page. And there are a number of postings there, articles that I've made reference to, and comments that I've chosen to put there, along with the link to the article. And in those postings, I try to give you some idea as to why I think it's an article that would be worth your time. The last one that I put on, which I believe was yesterday, and I hadn't mentioned, I hadn't intended to spend any time here at the Virtual Center during our program with this particular article, but let me recommend it again. Many of you I know are familiar with Dave Barry. Dave Barry has been a columnist for a number of years. He writes I believe in the Miami Herald or the Sentinel. I'm not sure which paper offhand, but he's a regular columnist. I do believe he's retired. He's written a number of books. But on the 1st of January, for the last several years, Dave Barry has published a look back on the year that just ended. And this year's article on the year 2016, like the previous ones, is a classic. And I posted the link to it on our Facebook page and made several comments about it. Because I do believe that Dave Barry has a sense of humor which is infectious and enjoyable, and it seems like he has the talent of making the most basic things interesting. I put on the posting on the Facebook page as an example because I absolutely love this. I've heard I don't know how many different people talk about the campaign process and leading up to our November 8th elections. And people have commented, it's hard to believe that a system that is a presidential election process that had continued for a year and a half and had well over 20 candidates. And as the candidates began to drop away, what we ended up with was two candidates, both of whom probably set records as being the most unpopular. And it was a question, as we know, we talked about this numerous times here at the Virtual Center. It seemed like we were being asked as voters to choose the lesser of two evils. And we've had a number of people explain the negatives associated with the choices we ended up with. Dave Barry's comment was, which I thought was just absolutely delightful way of putting it. He said what we ended up with was the equivalent of ointment versus suppositories, and I really enjoyed that. When I read this the other day, that little phrase keeps coming back to me, and I just thought it was delightful. And in the process, not only does he talk generally about the year just gone by in a way which is infectious and enjoyable, but then he goes through each month of the year and talks about the campaign, talks about Bernie Sanders, the Sanders phenomenon, so to speak, and the whole idea of Bernie Sanders catching on, given who he was, who he is. He seems to be the least predictable candidate ever. I mean, there was nothing in his background or whatever that would indicate the level of popularity, the way that he was able to touch so many people, especially young people, and bring new people into the political process that had never been there before. And the fact that he's an avowed democratic socialist, and of course the word socialist has all sorts of connotations to people. Dave Barry addresses that. And talks about the fact that somehow Bernie Sanders was able to convince people that the socialism he reflected was the kind of socialism which promised people a lot of free stuff, as opposed to the kind of socialism that revolved around people fighting for the last crumb, so to speak, which is the approach to socialism that most of us have grown up with and are comfortable with. So anyway, it's just a very, very perceptive, creative, enjoyable piece of writing. And Dave Barry has been doing this now for a number of years on New Year's Day. And if you go to the internet and you Google Dave Barry's essay on 2016, you will find it. And I put the link on our Facebook page. And I think you'll thoroughly enjoy it. The issues that I'd like to deal with, I've got two issues, and it's one of those. I'm in one of those situations where it's really hard to tell exactly how much time we'll be consuming with these issues. But for those of you who are regular followers of the Virtual Center, you'll know that the last issue that I really tried to take on seriously was the issue of foreign policy, most especially the issue of foreign policy as it seems to be being affected by Donald Trump's impending presidency. I can remember, it's quite a while ago now, but I can remember doing a program, a couple of weeks ago on the changes to American foreign policy that Donald Trump seems to be promising. And again, I mention this all the time because it's very, very difficult to nail down exactly what's going to happen, whether it's foreign policy, whether it's domestic policy, or whatever. There was a conversation this morning on the Morning Joe program on MSNBC. I think it's a real issue. It was about the media. And the general gist of the conversation is that an awful lot of people's, and there are many people, and I'm one, concern about the Trump presidency is based on the media's treatment of Donald Trump and the extent to which Donald Trump has been effectively able to manipulate the media and the media's treatment of him with his tweets, with these tweet storms that he undertakes in the middle of the night, so to speak. We talked about this throughout the campaign. He was able to control the news, the media. He made sure that each day's headline included his name. He was able to manipulate in such a way that he was able to get throughout the campaign all of this publicity. He really dominated the news. And everything else took a backseat, and none of the competitors to his candidacy were able, it seems, to combat that. Hillary Clinton spent millions of dollars in political advertising, way more than Donald Trump was forced to spend, because Donald Trump was getting so much free airtime as a result of his ability to control the media. And even today, our local paper ran a story about the appearance this weekend of Sean Spicer, who's going to be press secretary for Donald Trump. And Spicer was making the rounds this weekend on the Sunday talk shows. And Spicer made the point that Donald Trump will indeed continue to use Twitter to connect and remain connected with the American people. He will indeed engage in an ongoing conversation with the American people. And in the process, at least up to this point, the media has responded to these tweets that he puts on a daily basis. To the point, and Spicer mentioned this, and I think it's well worth considering, to the point that many of the issues, real issues, that the media really might be focusing on tend to take a back seat to the things that Donald Trump is putting in these these Twitter episodes that he engages in. That the media over the months has become so sensitive to what Donald Trump puts on Twitter that he is literally able to manipulate the media to the point that he can dictate what they talk about, and of course, what that means is, by inference, what they don't talk about. And the fact of the matter is, many things that the media ought to be focusing on, they aren't. And Spicer's examples are some of his appointments. I don't think that the media has done anything near the kind of investigation and paid the kind of attention to Donald Trump's nominees for particular offices that they would have in the past with an incoming administration. While we did get an awful lot of attention paid to Rex Tillerson, his nominee for Secretary of State, some weeks ago, the fact of the matter is, in recent days and weeks, Tillerson has pretty much disappeared from the front pages of our newspapers Nobody's talking about him anymore. Yet the fact of the matter is, Congress reconvenes tomorrow, I believe. And the first thing that Congress is going to do after once it gets back in business, is begin to take on some of its commitments and some of the programs and policies that Donald Trump has articulated. And many of them are significant. The Senate is going to begin hearings on a number of these nominees. And they are extremely significant, and they promise significant things. So again, I really do believe that there are some real issues here and things we need to consider. And hopefully we'll be able to consider them here at the Virtual Center. And one of the issues that I want to go back to, it's the last one that we touched on, but for reasons which I've already alluded to, I really didn't get the opportunity to expand and elaborate on some of these things, is the issue of foreign policy. And you may recall that one of the points that I tried to make, and I've made it more than once, in relation to foreign policy, is that there seems to be, or seems to have been, a concerted effort in this country to downplay the study of foreign policy. Newspapers around the world have alluded to the point for a long time that Americans tend to be the least informed people about foreign policy, about their world, that most of what Americans know about foreign policy is based on the issues that the media raises. And the fact of the matter is, the issues that the media raises are often driven by factors other than informing and educating the American people on international affairs. The point that I made here at the Virtual Center some time ago was that a lot of this, I believe, and this is just my sense, is a reaction to the Vietnam experience. Many prominent people in this country believed, whether in fact it's true or not, that an awful lot of the anti-war movement that grew out of the Vietnam experience was driven by and led by those who were extremely knowledgeable about foreign policy in this country. Many of the most active campuses during the anti-Vietnam War demonstrations, many of the campuses that were most active were in part, large part, active because of the visibility and the pronouncements of some members of the faculty whose expertise was American foreign policy. I experienced that myself. I went to the University of Wisconsin, which was one of the most active campuses during the late 60s and into the early 70s. And on that campus, when I first went there in 67, 68, 69, on that campus was William Appleman Williams. And a European historian named Harvey Goldberg. They were activists in the traditional sense of the word. They had tremendous followings among students, the student population. And many of the people who were directly impacted by Harvey Goldberg and by William Appleman Williams were intricately involved in the anti-war demonstrations on that campus. And my sense is that the same thing happened on many of the other campuses as well. Berkeley, Columbia, Cornell. I'm trying to think of some of the other major campuses that experienced significant anti-war activity. All of them reacted. Some of them reacted much more violently, and if you will, than others. And the fact of the matter is, these tended to be institutions with a strong international affairs, foreign policy component. The result was that when many of these faculty members were retired, or began to retire, or began to move to other places, increasingly they were not being replaced. The positions were being filled, but they were not being filled by foreign policy experts. They were being filled in many places. These openings, faculty openings, if you will, were being transferred to other departments. As most of the attention through the 70s and 80s and 90s, and I think conservative historians and conservative commentators were pointing this out during that period, that much of the emphasis on the campuses in the 70s, 80s, and 90s began to focus on social issues, on issues of gender and race, poverty, these kinds of things. And increasingly, foreign policy became a non-issue. And the fact of the matter is, it was reflected in the fact that fewer and fewer students, graduate students and undergraduate students, were specializing in foreign policy. The result is that in our schools, in our K through 12 classrooms, there was less and less attention being paid to international affairs. Most of what our young people were learning about international affairs was based on what the textbooks were telling them. And what the textbooks were telling them was a very limited, very superficial, and often very political presentation, if you will. And so consequently, I believe that we probably do have the most ill-informed population of any developed nation in the world when it comes to an appreciation of American foreign policy. And I believe that that's a shame. I believe it's a loss. I believe it's a loss because there's a lot to be learned. It doesn't necessarily follow that learning will result in some sort of radical anti-American action. I think, unfortunately, the associations that came out of the Vietnam experience, some of them obviously are accurate, but I think some of them go over the edge, so to speak. In my own case, let me explain what I mean there. It seems to me that there was much that was involved in American behavior internationally that needed to be talked about and revealed because it was inconsistent with our values, our ideals, and the vision of our founders. The fact of the matter is, we in the past have been guilty of doing some things which run counter to our values and our ideals. My sense is that we're back to the same thing now. It is based on ignorance. I don't think that ignorance is good. I don't think that our international behavior and our international situation is going to be improved because our people don't know things that they ought to know. I'm obviously, my whole life has been focused on education. I'm not an advocate of ignorance. I have serious doubts and serious questions about the adage that ignorance is bliss. I think ignorance is dangerous. I think education is positive. But when education is politicized, it turns positives into negatives. And I think that's kind of what we need to look out for. What all of this is, what I'm basically saying now is all of this is to say that there's a lot about American foreign policy that we need to know. And my sense is, unfortunately, that a lot of people in this country don't know it. And they're never going to know it if they trust totally in the media to learn it. Because the fact of the matter is the media themselves are often product of the political biases that have perpetrated our foreign policy over the years. The reason that I mention this, and the reason that I believe this topic is worthy of our attention here at the Virtual Center, is because Donald Trump, even before he takes office, has suggested strategies and suggested policies, international policies and behavior that raises serious questions about things that haven't been discussed and talked about for years. You'll remember a couple of weeks ago when we first raised this issue, what really precipitated the conversation more than anything else was Donald Trump's raising questions about the One China policy. And all of this came as a result of the infamous phone call congratulating him for his November 8th victory in the election from the president of Taiwan. And all of this raised serious questions because once that call, that official communique, if you will, from Taiwan to the United States became known, China reacted. And out of that came what, for some people, I'm convinced, was totally news. And that is that for many years, since the late 70s, we have been operating on what the media refers to as the One China policy. And I believe that many people, too many people, don't understand that, don't know where it came from, don't know what the basis of it is, and really don't understand wherein and how Donald Trump is challenging some of the major assumptions that have driven our foreign policy for years. And so the last time we addressed this here at the Virtual Center, the basic theme that I wanted to develop, and I began to do it, and then was kind of, obviously unable to complete it, was the issue of the whole idea of the One China policy, the whole idea of America's foreign policy priorities associated with the term Pax Americana, the American peace, as it's called, versus the traditional idea of foreign policy based on the principles of spheres of influence. And it seems to me critical that we understand those differences, because there's absolutely no question that Pax Americana represents an American-led international set of agreements that major nations have bought into and had agreed upon. And Donald Trump is challenging many of these in some of his foreign policy pronouncements, even before he takes office. And when he questioned the legitimacy of the one China policy and basically followed up with an explanation that the only reason we should continue to pursue or to support a one China policy is because it suits us. Because he has made it very clear that his foreign policy is going to be based on America first. That no longer does the Trump foreign policy indicate that the peace and order and stability of the world is going to be our priority. Because clearly Trump believes that as a result of that, we are losing everywhere. We aren't winning everywhere. I'm kind of paraphrasing Donald Trump here in many of his speeches. We don't seem to win anymore. China's taken advantage of us. Russia's taken advantage of us. Cuba took advantage of us. North Korea's taken advantage of us. People don't fear us anymore. And of course, Donald Trump's position is they don't respect us. And his basic idea is that the way you earn respect is through your power, as a result of your power. So basically, Donald Trump, and he has said this, seems to be operating on an idea of peace through strength. And this is quite different than the foreign policy that we have been pursuing. So what I wanted to do is clarify these two differences and make clear what in our past, in our historical past, would clarify these positions with the result that we would be hopefully a little bit better informed as we prepare for the onset of the Trump presidency on January 20th. Because there's no question that foreign policy is going to be on the front burner in a number of places. Over the past week to 10 days, of course, the issue has been Israel. And the issue has been the two-state solution to the Arab-Israeli crisis in the Middle East. And many of us, of course, were privy to Secretary of State John Kerry's speech last Wednesday, in which Kerry really came out strongly against the Netanyahu conservative position on the settlements, the West Bank settlements that are being promoted and pushed and defended by the Netanyahu administration in Israel. And so ultimately what we have is a situation where the outgoing Obama administration basically played a role in bringing the criticism of the world on Israel's behavior. And the extent to which Donald Trump took a position on the side of Israel, but especially on the side of Netanyahu. I think it's very important, and this is the part of Kerry's speech that doesn't get the attention. Kerry's position was that this administration, the Obama administration, has probably been a better friend to Israel than many previous administrations. And the basic proof of that is the Obama administration's commitment to a $38 billion military aid program directed towards Israel over the next 5 years. That tends to be downplayed, while the media tends to focus on the political discord between the incoming Trump administration and the outgoing Obama administration, and what this means in terms of Middle East policy. John Kerry's major theme, of course, in his speech was the idea that most of the world had pretty much come to a consensus that the only way to resolve the Middle East crisis was with a two-state policy, that somehow the Israelis and the Palestinians both were going to have to recognize the right of each of them to exist and to have their own independent state. And the fact of the matter is, as Kerry points out, most of the world had come to an agreement that that was the best way to go. The fact of the matter is it hasn't happened. And throughout the Obama administration, the full 8 years, it hasn't happened, even though he came into office in 2009 with a promise that it was going to become a priority of his administration. It hasn't happened. There's no question that one of the reasons it hasn't happened is because of the Netanyahu administration in Israel and the degree to which prominent conservatives in this country support Netanyahu and oppose President Obama. And I think if we think back to the infamous Iran nuclear deal of a few months ago, when 50 prominent Republicans signed the letter criticizing the Obama entry into the Iranian military deal and the Republican invitation to Netanyahu to come over to this country and address Congress, bypass the administration in doing that. I mean, there's a lot of background and history to this. But the fact of the matter is, what I'd like to do is to, if I can, is to develop a little bit of the background about American foreign policy, focusing especially on the differences between international affairs based upon the idea of spheres of influence versus the idea of an ordered, secure, stable world built around a set of principles which happen to be our principles, and therefore have brought the term Pax Americana to life. What I'd like to do is go back. Well, I mean, we can obviously go back to the very beginning. We can really go back to the beginning with the Washington administration, and more specifically with Washington's farewell address and Washington's idea that American foreign policy ought to make it a priority to ultimately maintain its flexibility and its independence in international affairs. You'll remember that throughout the 1790s, throughout the Washington administration, and right on into the John Adams administration in the last 4 years of the 18th century, the nation was torn over the 1778 alliance between the American colonies and the Continental Congress and the government of France. You'll remember that during the American Revolution, the colonies fighting for their independence from Great Britain were able to secure the support of France in a Treaty of Alliance, 1778. In the 1790s, during the Washington administration, when war in Europe broke out between France and Great Britain, the nation was torn over whether our principal priorities ought to be to honor the treaty and support France in this ongoing struggle with Britain, or whether, in fact, America's future would best be guaranteed with a closer relationship with the former mother country, with Great Britain. And this tended to split this nation into two major parties. The Jeffersonian Republican Party, whose priority tended to lean towards honoring the French treaty, versus the Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, who believed that America's economic future was going to be dependent on a positive relationship with Great Britain. And then when push came to shove, when Washington made the decision to retire, not to run for a third term, and issued in 1796 his famous farewell address. In that address, Washington's advice to the nation was that the United States needed to maintain its flexibility and its maneuverability in foreign affairs. That the worst thing the nation could do would be to tie itself to other major powers through alliances, referring specifically to the French alliance of 1778. And so ultimately, what Washington was recommending is that in an international struggle, but like the one that was pending between France and Great Britain, the best thing that the United States could do would be to maintain its neutrality. But it's also important to mention, if you read the farewell address carefully, Washington does not recommend that neutrality in international affairs become America's priority foreign policy position forever. What Washington makes very clear is that because we are a new nation, because we are a nation looking toward its own economic development, the kinds of decisions we make internationally have to be driven by our own priorities. And at this point in our history, this early point in our history, those priorities are best realized by maintaining neutrality and by avoiding what Washington calls entangling alliances with other foreign powers. Because what that often means is that we get dragged into situations which don't benefit us. And of course, Washington believes that that's exactly what's happening in this country right now in the 1790s. The nation is being torn apart by controversy over this foreign policy entangling alliance that we entered into in 1778 with France. But Washington believes that this is temporary, and that when we reach the point where our economy has been developed and is flourishing, and our military prowess has reached a certain point where we can match other powers of the world, at that point, our foreign policy needs to change. No longer is neutrality necessarily the best way to go. It could be, but all of this will depend on America's ability to make independent decisions related to our foreign policy. And so for a long time, through the early history of this country, we begin to see most of the attention, political attention in this country, focusing on the development of the nation. And foreign policy tends to be on the back burner, so to speak. It's happening, obviously. American foreign policy is constantly happening, but it's not getting the attention that domestic policy is, because the focus of this nation is on its own economic development. And of course, part of that development story is affected directly by the Civil War in the 1860s, the election of Abraham Lincoln. There's no question that the struggle that we refer to as the Civil War really became a struggle for the future of the nation. Up until 1860, through most of the nation's earlier years, much of our decision-making was being driven by the existence of slavery in the South and the threat of secession by the slave states if they didn't get their way in terms of international policy, tariff policy, taxes, international affairs, trade treaties, and all the rest of it. There's no question that the development of the nation couldn't receive the attention that it warranted so long as the nation remained divided between slavery and the free labor system. And if you read the speeches and the writings of Abraham Lincoln, it's very clear that he recognized that while the Civil War focused on the issue of slavery, the fact of the matter is the outcome of this war was going to determine the future of this nation. And during the immediate post-war period from 1865 into the early 1870s, the economic policies, the policies being developed in Congress during the period often referred to as, God, I'm stuck for the word. During the rehabilitation of the country, the restoration of the country, the Congress undertook a series of programs and policies designed to make the United States a major competitive world power. And that really becomes the dominant feature of American history during the late 19th century. The reason that historians have referred to 1890, to the 1890s, as a watershed in American history is because it's during that decade, the last decade of the 19th century, that the United States, for the first time, begins to emphasize and prioritize foreign policy decisions. And irony of ironies, much of this revolves around China and revolves around the Far East. What the United States is confronted with in the 1890s is a world where nations have conducted their foreign policy around the principle of spheres of influence. Developed nations who have made it a priority to colonize underdeveloped portions of the world in order to feed their own economic development. And many of these nations entered into treaties and arrangements with each other, many of them secret, that basically meant that for all practical purposes, much of the developed world became a series of international agreements built around the concept of spheres of influence. And all of this comes to a head in the late 90s in China. In 1898, the United States goes to war with Spain over Cuba. Most historians believe that the real issue behind the so-called Spanish-American War wasn't necessarily Cuba at all. Rather, it was the Far East. It was trade with China. More specifically, the United States needed access to the markets and the trade potential of China, the largest population on the face of the earth. And the fact of the matter is, what the United States quickly realized was that China was being carved up into spheres of influence by the major powers. It became very clear to America's foreign policy makers. Secretary of State during this period was John Hay, H-A-Y. It became very clear that China was being carved up into pieces by the major parties for purposes of exploitation. There was a sphere, a portion of China that was controlled by the British. There was another portion of China controlled by the French. Another portion of China controlled by Russia. And a portion of China that was a sphere of influence of Japan. So the fact of the matter is the nations of the world had been conducting foreign policy based on their own economic development and their own self-interest. And what they had been pursuing is a policy of developing spheres of influence. So I think the first thing we need to focus on here is what the idea of sphere of influence really means. Sphere of influence means a general recognition amongst other nations that this particular region is yours. One example. In China, the region controlled by the British was recognized by the other nations of Europe as being controlled by the British. In other words, there was general recognition this particular area is a British sphere of influence. This particular area is a French sphere of influence. This particular area is a Russian sphere of influence. This particular area is a Japanese sphere of influence. Well, the fact of the matter is when the United States enters into a war with Spain, the real prize in that war is the Philippines. Because securing control of the Philippines for the United States meant that the United States had ready access to China. It was right on the doorstep of the Far East. And the United States could develop the Philippines to the point that it could make a commercial thrust, if you will, into the China market. Problem was that by this time, most of China was already divided up into spheres of influence belonging to the other major powers. The only nation that didn't have a sphere of influence in China was the United States. So the question is, should the United States pursue a sphere of influence in China for itself? Or is there another strategy, another way that might serve us better? And it's at this point in 1899 that Secretary of State John Hay writes the first set of open door notes to the major powers. And in this open door note, the first open door note, so to speak, in this set of open door notes, the United States makes a proposal for an alternative strategy to spheres of influence. And that is the idea of international agreement based on the principles of free trade and open competition. In other words, what the United States is proposing in the open door notes is an alternative to spheres of influence, is an alternative to the United States seeking its own sphere of influence in China. The rationale is it would be more beneficial for the United States to gain access to everybody else's sphere of influence than it would be to pursue our own sphere of influence. Because what that would mean is we would only be able to do business with one portion of potentially the largest commercial market on the face of the earth. Better if American commercial interests had access to all of China. The only way to gain access to all of China was to gain agreement among the nations that had spheres of influence there that they should make their spheres of influence open to everybody. Thus, the principle of the so-called open door. It doesn't mean that nations would abandon their spheres of influence. They would keep them. But what it does mean is that every nation would recognize the spheres of other nations. But the fact of the matter is, all nations would be able to do business in everybody else's sphere. The principle of free trade would overlay the idea of spheres of influence. And what Hay proposes is the idea of free trade in everybody else's sphere, in everybody's sphere of influence. And of course, the nation that would derive the greatest benefit from that would be the United States. Because we didn't have a sphere of influence, this gave us access to everybody else's. And of course, this is driven by the idea that by the late 19th century, the United States is convinced, while the Industrial Revolution is underway in this country, that the potential of the United States to dominate the world commercially is indeed feasible. That mainly what we needed more than anything else was access. Access to everywhere. That meant that we had to sell the principle of free and open trade, access to the seas, free and open competition for everybody everywhere. Yes, we would recognize that the British had a sphere of influence and the French had a sphere of influence. They would have an inordinate amount of authority in those regions. We respected that. But the idea is that if everybody opened their sphere to others, it would be based on the idea of agreement among all the major powers around a certain set of principles. If nations agreed on the principles of free trade, then it would suit everybody to maintain a world of peace. What they are talking about, what the open door notes propose, is a world order. A world order that really is being defined by the priorities of American foreign policy. And the purpose of the open door notes is to get the other major powers to agree to it. And the fact of the matter is, John Hay's policy is successful. And one by one, the major powers agree to the principles of the open door note. So the open door notes have two major goals, or two major elements in them. First is a commitment to the principles of free trade and the open door. And secondly, and this is critical, nations must commit to what the open door notes refer to as the territorial integrity of China. The one thing we all have to agree on is to maintain the political entity that we call China. Only when China remains a nation, a politically viable unit, can our policy of open trade and open door work. The worst thing that can happen to the principles of free trade and the open door is the division of China into spheres of influence, further spheres of influence. The worst thing that can happen is to be denied access to particular spheres. That is the danger. And so basically the principle of the open door is that if nations commit to the territorial integrity of China, then that means that all of us will have access to all of China, to each other's spheres of influence, and the principles and the ideas of free and equal access to the China market will drive foreign policy. There'll be no reason for wars between developed nations over resources, because all nations would commit to a principle which would give everybody access to whatever they can develop themselves. That becomes the principle of the open door. We've gone beyond the top of the hour. Let me pause there, because there is a second set of open door notes that occurs in the year 1900. But let's postpone that for 5 minutes or so and take our break. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We've reached the top of the hour. We've actually gone 4 or 5 minutes beyond the top of the hour. We'll pause for 5 minutes, and then we'll be right back, and we'll continue with this foreign policy story. Thank you. Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to our second hour here at the Virtual Center. We're at 10 minutes after the hour, and if you are just joining us, we're really back into the issue of foreign policy, and we're actually into the 19th century and the emergence of America's alternative to foreign policy based on spheres of influence. It's very clear that if you look at the idea of spheres of influence, what nations have gone to war over more than anything else throughout their history is control of wealth, resources. That's the danger of the idea of spheres of influence. It's based on foreign policy built around self-interest as being the priority of everybody. In other words, as a government, you enter into treaty agreements with others because those treaty agreements would seem to benefit you in one way or the other. Other nations do the same thing. So what you end up with is a world built around international agreements between one nation and another. Many of them conflict and overlap. There's no question, historians are absolutely agreed that what brought on World War I more than anything else was the existence of all of these secret treaties, all of these alliances that the major nations of Europe had entered into throughout the 19th century and into the early 20th century. So the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in 1914, the assassination of a seemingly non-influential individual in southeastern Europe, brought nations into conflict with each other, because most nations were connected by treaty with other nations. In many cases, an attack on one was treated as an attack on all. And the result was that the entire developed world exploded into World War I. That's what the idea of the open door was designed to prevent. It was an alternative to that kind of a world. It was a world based on universal agreements on a series of principles. These happened to be principles that really drove American foreign policy. But the thinking was that they were principles that would benefit everybody because they would prevent conflict. They would basically reward nations for cooperation and adherence to certain principles or certain unanimously agreed upon ideas or values. We call it the rule of law. Nations were creating a series of policies and agreements which becomes the essence of the international rule of law. The idea is that if nations all agree to abide by the same policies and the same principles, then it will become, then it would be necessary, it will become possible, not necessary, possible to alleviate conflict. Because the one thing that would disrupt the world order, the emerging world order, would be the self-interest that drove spheres of influence. So the open door notes in China reflect or represent an American alternative strategy to the world of spheres of influence, to foreign policy based upon spheres of influence, because they were potentially explosive and potentially dangerous. And 14 years later, in 1914, World War I was going to basically bear fruit to this concern. So the idea is that a world based on order and stability and common principles, built on the idea of rule of law, was seen as the most viable alternative. And the idea was to sell that principle. Now, it's important to realize what the United States position is in all of this. We are the new guy on the block. We don't have spheres of influence. By the time we get into this game, the best markets and the best sources of raw materials are already taken. There's no reason why the established nations of the world should help us become a major player. So in a sense, if we're going to play the sphere of influence game, we're going to have to fight our way in. We're going to have to elbow our way in to the world of nations. That doesn't seem to make sense. The idea of a world order as an alternative to the sphere of influence approach to foreign policy does seem to make sense. And this is the origin of what historians have come to refer to as Pax Americana. On the 16th of December, just a couple of weeks ago, Roger Cohen, columnist for the New York Times, wrote an article on China and Trump. And in it, he goes back to this idea of Pax Americana. Basically, his argument is that Donald Trump, in terms of some of the policies that he's enunciating and articulating, suggest to Cohen that Pax Americana is over. And then Cohen explains the basis of Pax Americana. I think it's a short paragraph, but I think it's a very telling one. Cohen says, America is an idea. Strip freedom, human rights, democracy, and the rule of law from what the United States represents to the world, and America itself is gutted. Of course, realpolitik, driven by self-interest, is integral to American foreign policy. But a valueless approach of the kind Trump proposes leaves the world rudderless, unquote. I'd like to focus on that because that really explains pretty well the basis of the New World Order as it's being defined within the United States, as it informs the crafting of the open door notes, so to speak. America is an idea. What we stand for internationally is a set of values and principles. And the basic premise, the foundation of these principles, is individual freedom, human rights, democracy, the rule of law. If we can get other nations to buy into those principles, then they can become the basic foundation points for a world of perpetual peace. What we're looking for in the open door notes is access to China without playing the game the way European nations have traditionally played it. We are proposing an alternative. Let's try it this way. Let's agree, and I'm putting this in my own words, of course. Let's agree, all of you nations that have spheres of influence in China. Let's agree on the principles of free trade, the idea of the open door, the idea that everybody ought to have the opportunity to trade anywhere in China they want to, whether it's in the British sphere, whether it's in the French sphere, the Russian sphere, the Japanese sphere, the German sphere. Let's all agree to the basic principles that we'll operate by. That way we all win. That way there's no reason for us to fight amongst each other, because as long as everybody adheres to those principles, everybody is winning. And by agreeing to that, that means that the United States gains access to the China market without having to develop a sphere of influence there. And that's really the premise of the first set of open door notes. The other piece, the other principle of the open door notes is the territorial integrity of China. All of this depends on maintaining China as a political entity, as a stable political structure with its own government. The fact of the matter is, it's being exploited by all of us who are there commercially doing business. But as long as China is able to maintain control and order amongst its own people, then all of us benefit. In other words, the only nation that has almost no say in the economic development of China is China. It's all of us major nations together that make the policy decisions on what ought to be or ought not to be going on in China. And in order to make that work, we need a Chinese government that will do our bidding. We need a Chinese government that is willing to allow us all to do business within China. Well, lo and behold, from the Chinese perspective, China is being exploited. And so in the early 1900s, a revolution breaks out within China called the Boxer Rebellion. And the whole idea of the Boxer Rebellion is to throw all the Western nations out of China and control China's economic development ourselves. If the Boxer Rebellion succeeds, everybody loses. So consequently, every nation that has a vested interest in China has an interest in making sure that the Boxers are not successful. The result is an international army of Western nations committed to the destruction of the Boxers, putting down the Boxer Rebellion. And once that's done successfully, then John Hay realizes that the dangers of spheres of influence exist once again. Because there's a danger that European nations, in retaliation for the Boxer Rebellion, will strengthen their spheres of influence and thereby jeopardize the entire apparatus laid out in the open door notes. So John Hay sends a second set of open door notes to the major powers, in which he asks all of them to reconfirm their commitment to the principles of free trade and the open door, and especially to the territorial integrity of China. The last thing we want to do, John Hay is saying to the major powers, is allow China to be carved up in retaliation for the brutality of the Boxer Rebellion. Because once China is carved up into pieces, we all lose. The only way we can all win in China is if China is retained as a political entity with its own government, with its own friendly government to us. And that's the second set of open door notes. The reason I focus on this content, on this detail, is because inherent in these open door notes is the basic principles of the world order as the United States foreign policy is taking shape going into the 20th century. This is the world that American policymakers believe will produce a world free of war, free of discord. It'll be a world based on competition, but it will be competition according to established rules and principles. Nations will behave according to the rule of law, according to the principles of free trade. We know that not too many years later, a little bit more than a decade later, Europe explodes into World War I. And very reluctantly, in 1917, Woodrow Wilson makes the decision that the United States must enter World War I on the side of the Allies, because if we don't, the Allies are going to lose. And if the Allies lose, we lose. It's at that point that Woodrow Wilson develops his peace program that ultimately becomes the basis for the Treaty of Versailles, for the peace treaty ending World War I. Wilson goes to Europe with his 14-point program. This is the program that he wants the victorious Allies to buy into as the principles of the open door world, because Woodrow Wilson in his speeches refers to World War I as the war to end all wars. What he means by that is, if we can get these major nations to buy into the principles which are in this 14-point program, then we'll never have to face another horrible war like World War I, because everybody will be buying into the same principles. Everybody will agree. Everybody will be agreed to operate according to the same principles, the same rules, the same laws. The only difference is that with this peace treaty, we will now have an enforcer, because the 14th point of Wilson's 14-point program is the creation of an international organization to enforce these principles, the League of Nations. Wilson believes that what brought on World War I was foreign policy based on spheres of influence, even though many of these nations had committed to certain principles in China. There was nobody to enforce these principles on reluctant nations. Nations were operating on faith more than anything else. World War I proved that faith didn't cut it. And Wilson believes that what you need is an enforcer, is an international organization based on these principles, whose job is to enforce these principles and make sure that members of the League live up to the policies and programs of the League of Nations. On January 8th, 1918, Wilson lays out his 14-point program. And this is his introduction to that program. Wilson says, "It will be our wish and purpose that the processes of peace, when they are begun, shall be absolutely open, and that they shall involve and permit henceforth no secret understandings of any kind." Period. In other words, diplomacy will be open. Everything will be above board. Everybody will know who's got this sphere, who's got that sphere, who's responsible for development in this area, who's responsible for development in that area. There'll be no more secret treaties, secret agreements, because Wilson realizes that's what brought on World War I. The assassination of Archduke Ferdinand brought this whole house of cards down on the developed world, as nations were tied in treaties with each other to the point that the whole world was dragged, sucked into this conflict, which became World War I. So Wilson's principles are that from now on, diplomacy is going to be open. Many people point out that this is an indication of just how naive Wilson's plan was. But be that as it may, he says, the day of conquest and aggrandizement is gone by. So is also the day of secret covenants entered into in the interest of particular governments, and likely at some unlooked-for moment to upset the peace of the world. Secret covenants, secret agreements that benefit particular governments, he said, at some point in time are going to upset the peace of the world. It is this happy fact, now clear to the view of every public man whose thoughts do not still linger in an age that is dead and gone, which makes it possible for every nation whose purposes are consistent with justice and the peace of the world to avow nor at any time the objects it has in view. We entered this war because violations of right had occurred, which touched us to the quick and made the life of our own people impossible, unless they were corrected and the world secure once for all against their recurrence. What we demand in this war, therefore, is nothing particular to ourselves. It is that the world be made fit and safe to live in, and particularly that it be made safe for every peace-loving nation which, like our own, wishes to live its own life, determine its own institutions, be assured of justice and fair dealing by the other peoples of the world against force and selfish aggression. All the peoples of the world are in effect partners in this interest. And for our own part, we see very clearly that unless justice be done to others, it will not be done to us. The program of the world's peace, therefore, is our program. And that program, the only possible program as we see it, is this. And then he lays out his 14-point principles. This is world order. What Wilson is talking about is getting the major nations of the world to agree that if we abide by these principles, if we all buy into these and we enforce them, we'll never, ever again experience anything as horrendous as World War I. So quickly, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but let's look at some of the points, some of these points. This is the basis of the world order that Wilson envisions. Number one, open covenants of peace, openly arrived at, after which there shall be no private international understandings of any kind, but diplomacy shall proceed always frankly and in the public view. No more secret treaties. Everything is the open. Everybody knows who's got trade agreements with everybody else. No secrets. That's the first principle. The second principle, the removal, so far as possible, of all economic barriers and the establishment of an equality of trade conditions among all the nations consenting to the peace and associating themselves for its maintenance. Free trade. Free trade for everybody. No more protectionism. The end of economic barriers which make it impossible for a nation to trade with another nation. They're all gone. Open trade. 3, absolute freedom of the seas, outside territorial waters, alike in peace and in war, except as the seas may be closed in whole or in part by international action for the enforcement of international covenants. So, open agreements, open covenants, openly arrived at. No secret diplomacy anymore. An end to all trade barriers, commitment to the principles of free trade. And third, access to the seas. Everybody has an opportunity to trade where and how they choose to. 4, adequate guarantees given and taken that national armaments will be reduced to the lowest point consistent with domestic safety, disarmament. A world armed to the teeth is not a world that will remain at peace, Wilson believes. So what we've got to do is we've got to encourage nations to disarm. Obviously, maintaining armaments enough to maintain domestic peace, to put down insurrections and rebellions within their own country. But at this time, there was competition among nations for the largest, strongest navies. And Wilson believed that disarmament was the way to go. So what you have is nations committed to free trade, open access to the oceans, no more secret diplomacy, and no nation armed to the teeth. All nations disarmed to the point that is practical. 5, a free, open-minded, absolutely impartial adjustment of all colonial claims based upon a strict observance of the principle that in determining all such questions of sovereignty, the interests of the populations concerned must have weight with the equitable claims of the government whose title is to be determined. What he's talking about here is sovereign rights of all peoples. Open-minded, free, absolutely impartial adjustment of colonial claims. So all major nations will have colonies, will have areas of the world that they can develop and exploit for purposes of their own economic development. If you guarantee and readjust the colonial claims of the major nations, then there'll be no reason to go to war over them. Because even though nations have certain areas that they claim as colonies, the fact of the matter is they'll all be governed by the principles of the open door, the principles of free trade and access. So the mere fact that Britain controls South Africa, for example, doesn't mean that we can't do business there. We can do business with South Africa. We just have to recognize that it's a British sphere of influence. Or we can do business with French Equatorial Africa as long as we recognize that it's a French sphere of influence. Then, beginning with point 6, Wilson begins to redraw the maps of the world. The evacuation, number 6, is the evacuation of all Russian territory and such a settlement of all questions affecting Russia as which will secure the best, freest cooperations of other nations of the world in obtaining for in obtaining for her an unhampered and unembarrassed opportunity for the independent determination of her own political development. In other words, it is key that Russia be considered a major partner in this operation. Then he goes to Belgium. Number 7, in Belgium, the whole world will agree, must be evacuated and restored without any attempt to limit the sovereignty which she enjoys in common with all other free nations. Then number 8 deals with French territory. 9, the readjustment of the frontiers of Italy. 10, the peoples of Austria-Hungary, whose place among the nations we wish to see safeguarded and assured, should be accorded the freest opportunity to autonomous development. In other words, they address the flashpoints throughout the world in many of these points. And then when you get down, number 13 is Poland. And 14, a general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. So in other words, you have a League of Nations that will enforce these principles of free trade, open seas. I would suggest that Wilson's 14-point program is a specific definition of what we call Pax Americana. If you can put yourself in, as I try to do, put yourself in Wilson's position. If the nations all agree to these principles, they all buy in, they agree to the terms of the League of Nations, they're willing to disarm, they're willing to recognize the rights of other nations to exist and to conduct free trade. They're willing to recognize that other nations have colonies and spheres of influence which they control. If we can get everybody to agree on this and get the League of Nations to enforce these rules and these principles and make sure that nobody violates them, then Wilson does believe that World War I can really be the war to end all wars. As most people realize who have studied this, the major problem here is that it's only the victorious powers that are invited in. Germany is left out. And the German people are forced, as part of the Treaty of Versailles, to accept full responsibility for World War I and agree to reimburse nations for the loss of life and property associated with World War I. Translation: Germany is forced to accept total responsibility for World War I and is saddled with a commitment to pay for it. The German people, Germany as a nation, is humiliated, which, as we know, creates a situation which is ripe for a dictator, for an Adolf Hitler. And that's indeed exactly what happens. The other thing, of course, another thing that goes wrong with the 14-point program and the Treaty of Versailles is that the United States itself refuses to join. The United States Senate refuses the terms of admission to the League of Nations. And many prominent leaders of the United States Senate agree that if the rest of the world is involved in the League of Nations committed to these principles, then in effect we win without even having to join. Many people believe that the League lacks the punch, lacks the ability to enforce, because the United States is not a member of it. But this is the definition of the world order that becomes the driving priority of American foreign policy from the end of the 19th century to the present. This is the world order that produces free trade agreements, NAFTA, the TPP, military budgets, and all the rest of it. with the creation after World War II of the United Nations, I think we mentioned this before, that during World War II, Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt meet at Yalta. And at that meeting, they agreed to create the United Nations. They agreed to not make the mistake that we made at the end of World War I. They want the international organization, the international agreement, based on the principles which will preserve world order, human rights, democratic government, freedom, individual freedom, and operation according to the rules of law. That is the definition of Pax Americana. That is the charter of the United Nations. In order for it to work, all the major nations of the world need to belong to it. In order to make sure that the Soviet Union under Stalin is willing to go along, Stalin is given all sorts of concessions. Many people believe that Roosevelt gave away the farm to Russia during World War II. The thinking is that none of this will work if Soviet Union is not a party to it. So with the creation of the Security Council and the veto of Security Council members, both Soviet Union and China are given permanent seats on the Security Council. They are given access to the veto, which means that the United Nations can't take action unless all the major members of the Security Council agree. So the idea is that by allowing China and the Soviet Union to be members of the Security Council, permanent members, what you are doing is guaranteeing their participation in this world order. With the fall, of course, we know that Russia took advantage, Soviet Union took advantage of it, the Cold War ensued, and all the rest of it. But with the fall in 1989 of the Berlin Wall, the fall of the Soviet Empire, if you will, the end of the Cold War, supposedly. The idea is that from then on, the principles which drove American foreign policy for the last century could once and for all be implemented. Now that the threat of international communism was gone with the fall of the Soviet Union. And of course, in the 90s, Bill Clinton becomes president. Bill Clinton buys into the principle of globalization, the idea of the orchestrated development of the entire world based on these principles of free trade, access to the sea, free trade, regional free trade agreements, and all the rest of it. And as we know, the one thing that was overlooked here was the flow of American jobs and the inclination of corporate executives to move their businesses to where labor was cheapest and unions were weakest. And the result was that many of the best jobs, which made the United States what it was, leave the country. The fact of the matter is, the international goals of Pax Americana were being realized. There's no question that world poverty has, in effect, been turned around. But in the developed nations themselves, the result is the loss of jobs and, of course, the implementation of technology and all the rest of it, along with globalization, has meant that many nations, many of the developed nations have lost jobs and have faced the kind of crisis that we faced in this country and that England faced when it made the decision to leave the European Union, and the American citizens made on November 8th when they elected Donald Trump. Because Donald Trump is challenging in his pronouncements about China, now his determination to become friendly with Russia and with Putin, his position to support Netanyahu in Israel. It's very clear that Donald Trump is taking foreign policy positions which fly in the face of these established principles of world order as defined and implemented through the initiative of the United States throughout the 20th century. It's important for all of us to realize that. When Donald Trump talks about America first, when he talks about not necessarily adhering to the one China policy, the only reason that we would continue to support the one China policy, Trump says, is if it's a part of some trade agreement, some negotiated deal between the United States and China. In other words, if China makes it worth our while to continue to support the one China policy, we'll do it. Our decisions will be made on what's best for us, not the principles of the international order. That's really what is going on internationally, and I think all of us need to be aware of it and need to recognize it because it is very, very important. I'm looking for, I've got a statement here that I wanted to share with you. Here it is, about Donald Trump. These are the statements that Donald Trump made during the height of the debate over Taiwan and the issue of the one China policy. Donald Trump, this is the Cohen Cohen article, Stephen Cohen, about Trump and NATO. Because not only did Donald Trump question the one China policy, he's also questioned whether in fact we'll continue to support NATO. As many people know, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was created as part of our containment policy to contain the Soviet Union. Theoretically, the world order that we have, if you think about it, the existence of NATO tends to contradict the Pax Americana world order, because NATO was created primarily to contain the expansion of the Soviet Union into Eastern Europe, as many of these other international agreements were also. So when Donald Trump says that NATO may have outlived its usefulness, maybe if people don't pay their bills as partners in NATO, then maybe we won't support the idea of an attack on one is an attack on all. The implication is that Donald Trump is questioning and challenging many of the principles that really over the last century have become the basis of the world order as it has been defined and implemented by the United States. This is the policy that the Obama administration has been committed to pursuing. So much of the conflict, foreign policy conflict, between Obama on the one hand and the incoming Trump administration on the other is based on these principles. Donald Trump is questioning this idea of Pax Americana, of the world order. He's questioning the existence of these international free trade agreements. His basic position as a businessman is that what we have to do is negotiate in our own best interest. If nations begin to do that, then the world order as it's existed for the last century is over. What we will be doing is returning to the old idea of spheres of influence, trade agreements among one nation and another. In a sense, I guess the question is, to what extent is Donald Trump and his advisors, to what extent are they familiar with and cognizant of exactly what stands behind the principles and the positions that they are taking? I think this is something that all of us need to keep in mind and be familiar with. So again, if you think back just to last week about the issue over Israel and the so-called two-state policy as the solution between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and Netanyahu's challenge of that, extremely important, it seems to me. Like everybody else, I've had my major concerns about the incoming Trump administration and about some of the pronouncements and some of the things that Donald Trump says he's going to do and going to change and going to shelve and all the rest of it. I think there's a couple of things that all of us need to keep in mind. And that is that maybe many of these things do need to be revisited. I would suggest that much of the media attack and criticism of the incoming Donald Trump's administration is driven in part by the fact that the people, the major columnists and media folks, have been raised within the confines of the world that we've spent today's program defining. They grew up in a world driven and dominated by Pax Americana, by the principles outlined by Woodrow Wilson in the 14-point program and by John Hay in the Open Door Notes. Consequently, they have assumed that these are the right principles because they have maintained peace through the Cold War to the present. So the question is, maybe the world has changed to the point that these policies and principles are no longer effective. For example, NATO. NATO is a product of the Cold War. The purpose of NATO was to organize Western nations in order to contain the expansion of the Soviet Union into Eastern Europe. Well, the fact of the matter is the Soviet Union is no longer existent. But NATO is still there. And the fact of the matter is we continue to pump money and resources and military weaponry into NATO. NATO, in other words, not from the Soviet perspective, because the Soviet Union is no longer there. From the Russian perspective, from the perspective of Vladimir Putin, NATO suggests that in the Western mind, the Cold War is still on. If the West didn't believe that, then they wouldn't still have NATO. The fact of the matter is, that may be correct. Maybe it's time to rethink the role of Russia in today's contemporary world. If that has any validity to it at all, then maybe Donald Trump's position vis-a-vis Vladimir Putin makes some sense, because all of it we must keep in mind is involved in whether Putin has leverage over Trump and all the rest. We know all of this, and Tillerson's role as president and CEO of ExxonMobil and all the rest of it. We understand all of these other issues. But the fact of the matter is, in a way, Donald Trump is raising questions about things that nobody has questioned for a long time. Maybe many of these things should be questioned. Maybe it's time to put a number of these issues back on the table. I believe we're getting pretty close to the end of our program today. I don't want to run over. Well, it's according to the clock on my computer, it's 58 minutes after the hour. So I guess it's time. I had no idea when we started this that it would take basically the full 2 hours. I hope that this has been informative. That's been my goal, is to try to lay out the differences between the world order and the assumptions which make it possible versus the sphere of influence and the kinds of assumptions that drove it. And suggest that this has been the priority of American foreign policy. It's very clear whether, in fact, there's rationale behind this or not. Many of the pronouncements that Donald Trump has made about international affairs fly in the face of much of these things. The media's inclination is to suggest that Trump is the bull in the china shop. He doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't know what he's questioning. Fact of the matter is, maybe he does. We'll be back tomorrow here at the Virtual Center. I remind you that we'll be beginning 1/2 hour later than today, 1:30 Eastern Standard Time. I invite you to be with us. I invite you to share this program with your friends. We have some changes that we're going to be making, I think. I'm going to try to be able to post portions of these programs on our Facebook page on a regular basis, and I'm hoping that that'll give people an opportunity to keep up and to be fresh with each and every program. This is Bill O'Brien. Thank you so very much for listening. Have a wonderful day. Be safe, and thank you.